Thus far, we've created an empty activity project and used the constraint layout, which is the default layout in Android Studio. And the constraint layout, as we've seen, allows us to put on various widgets or views and constrain those to each other using some rules that we are able to set up. There are other layouts though, and we'll look at those throughout this course. So layouts include absolute layout, which everything is positioned hard and fast by coordinates. It's probably the more difficult layout to maintain and is maybe useful for doing a project for your own device, but not good for multiple devices. And so we won't really spend any or very much time on absolute layouts, but we will look at frame layouts in which we can do layers and have items on top of one another. A grid layout in which everything is composed of rows and columns. A linear layout which flows from top to bottom, but can also have horizontal layouts internal to that flow from left to right. The relative layout is largely replaced by the newer constraint layout, and so we're going to ignore the relative layout in this course, but we'll look at table layouts, which are a little similar to grid layouts. There are also layouts that can be placed inside of layouts, and the two we'll look at particular are the drawer layout, in which we have a menu maybe coming in from the left-hand side, and a tab layout, where we can use tabs to navigate. There's also a circular reveal layout for doing some animations, and as we talk about animations, if we get time towards the end of the course, we'll look at the circular reveal layout. I want to spend a little more time though on the constraint layout because that is the default, and that is probably the most useful and the most powerful of all the layouts. And since constraints can be a little confusing, let's talk a little more about how to use constraints to our advantage. I've created a new project called Constraints Demo 1 and used the empty activity, which gives us the Hello World text view centered in our XML file. So a couple things about this. It's got constraints already set up in terms of start, top, end, and bottom. And we see those are all set to 0, which places it in the center. Up at the top here, I don't think I've mentioned that there is a button with a little X in it and a curved S line which represents the constraints. We can click that and clear all the constraints. So now I have a Hello World text view that's not constrained. If I were to run this, of course, it would go to the top left. So now if I right-click on Hello World, I could also clear the constraints from that object. I can set up constraints, parent, top, bottom, start, end. There's also a center option here where I can do it horizontally in the parent, and I can center it vertically in the parent. And right now, the declared attributes are that these are all tied to the parent, and the layout constraints are in the center. I can grab the layout and pull it up, and notice that now the layout constraint as far as the vertical bias has changed to 0.238. I can also change the vertical bias with the sliders. And of course I could type in a value. Maybe I want this to be 0.33. So there's something that Google calls the inner lines of the constraint widget. And notice there are some chevrons here, and those chevrons tell us that these constraints are each set to the wrap content, which you see up here. Now I can change that, maybe for the layout width, rather than wrap content, I want to say match constraint. And my constraints right now are at 0 on the left and the right, so it stretches that text view to match the constraint at 0 and 0. If I were to change these values, we'll see that the constraints are being applied. And it shows up in the layout width as 0 dp. That's the match constraint. Now notice the inner lines here that have changed. We get the little, I'd probably call it a heartbeat line. That is the match constraint. In fact, I can point to it, it says match constraint. If I point to the chevrons, it says wrap content. I can also click on these lines and change them here. So if I click on it, and now it goes back to the chevrons, where it's wrapping the content. I'm going to click one more time. There's a third option here, and that is the actual measurements. Based on the measurements that I've given the text view, that's the width. So the width is no longer defined by the constraints or by the content. And if I stretch this out, you'll see that the layout width has changed. So now these are hard-coded values. If I want to go back, I can click the lines, go back to the match constraints, or the wrap content. Same with the vertical. Match constraints, which are 0 and 0. So now my text view goes all the way from the top to the bottom. Probably not real practical. Click those again. Now I've got the chevrons where it's wrapping the content. And click again, I get the line, which is going to be the hard-coded value, in this case 20. And of course I could change that to, say, 30. I'm going to stretch this out a little bit more. We've looked at before that we can change the location of the contents inside the widget. And for a text view, there is the text alignment. And I could have that be at the text end or the view end, which in this case is going to be the same. Same with the view start and the text start. It's going to be the upper left-hand corner. Center centers it horizontally but not vertically. And if I want it to do both, I need to go to gravity. And in gravity, I can then set up some forces for that object. And I could choose to center horizontally and center vertically. Click Apply, and my text is centered in the text view. I'm going to scroll back up to the constraints. I'm going to set the left and the right the same. That'll keep it centered. I'm going to add another widget, which is going to be an image view. And I preloaded some graphics here of world, world small, and world smallest. These are just basically the same image, but in 3 different versions. For the XXX, world is 600, world small, 600 by 600. World small, I think I did 300 by 300, and world smallest is 100 by 100. So I'm going to choose world. That's our large image. And I put those images in Canvas in the Week 2 module, so you can download those and if you want to play along and install those. This image view is set to wrap content by default. I can choose to center it horizontally in the parent. And maybe I want to do a constraint from the top to the bottom of my Hello World text view, and I can specify a distance. Now if I change the layout width to 0 and 0 match constraints, it collapses on itself because there's no bottom constraint. If I set a bottom constraint, now I'm using that constraint and it's going to take up the whole area. Let's take that bottom constraint and set it to 32. I can specify a height. And in doing that, I'm actually going to get rid of my bottom constraint. I can remove the constraint in the constraint view by clicking the little blue X when I point to it in the constraint view, and that'll remove it. And that now reapplies my 32 dp distance to Hello World. But my constraint here is pretty wide. When you have one of the either the layout width or the layout height set to match constraint, for the image view you get this little triangle and you can set a dimension ratio. So here I want my dimension ratio to be 1:1, which is the default that comes up because it's the same number of pixels wide as it is high. And so now as I make this larger, you'll see the image also grows to the size of whatever I put it. And if I stretch it up and don't stretch it in, it goes back to this layout width being defined. I can come back and set it to match constraint. And of course, within the image view, we can also have a scale option. Scale type, center and side, so that's going to use the actual size. Center is going to be the same thing, but if I choose center crop, in this case, I have a wider image than it is tall, and it's cropping the image to fit. I can choose fit center. That's probably the best option. Now if I choose fit start, that's going to put it to the left, and fit end will put it to the right. And we'll ignore the matrix for now. There's also a fit XY, in which it will stretch to fit the image, and you generally want to try to avoid that. We all know the world is not oblong or egg-shaped. It is round, and we want to present it as round. I'm going to choose fit center again, and I'll come back and set the width to be match constraint. I'm going to add a text view and add another text view. In this text view, I'm going to constrain to the left. We'll give it 32 pixels. This one constrain to the right. And I'm going to constrain my first text view to the bottom of my image view. And I'd like to have this one line up with it. Now I could constrain the text view to the same amount. 66 is the distance here. But there's a couple other options that I can do. I can align these two objects together, and the easiest way to do that is in the component tree to select both of them. So I have text view 3 and text view 4. Those two objects either highlighted. I could also click one and hold down the shift key and click the other. That would also select them. I'm going to right click, choose align, and I could choose to align them on their horizontal centers. I can align them on the bottom edges. I can align them on the top edges. And then there's also an option for looking more in a vertical format of left edges, right edges, and vertical centers. But there's also this baseline option. And the baseline option is great for widgets that have text in them. For example, let's say that this text view was a larger font. So I'm going to come down and choose text size, and let's make it 28 SP. And let's also make it bold. So there's a text style, and I can make it bold. Okay, so what I like to do is have these two items aligned together on the baseline. Now if I align it to the top, the smaller text view is going to be above or slightly above the baseline for the text view. If I align it below, it'll probably be a little bit below. But if I choose both of them and I come to align and say align baselines, now aligns those two baselines together. So we can align objects to each other. We can also create what's called chains to help us distance items from one another. We'll look at creating chains in the next lesson. If you just jumped into this video, you can see all the videos from the Android App Development Cohort playlist by clicking on the image in the lower right. And if you'd like to be alerted to future videos that I create, you can click my picture up in the top right and subscribe to the channel.